anagrams. He used symbolism. He used many other languages. He used made-up words. And so they're very difficult to understand, and there's almost 1,000 of them. And this is the first time all of them have ever been interpreted. There's books out there that tell you what the words mean and the cities and things, but they don't tell you what the prophecy means. But I didn't know any of this when I started out with this. So the woman goes back to where she is a student of Nostradamus in France, and I was thinking, well, maybe she could tell me something about this great man, and maybe it'd make an interesting chapter in a book of miscellaneous regressions down the road. That book of miscellaneous regressions turned into a 3-volume set. But she began telling me about Nostradamus, so she was a student. And at that time, I didn't know that he had students, but they were studying with him in secret, because at that time, they would have been killed. He would have been killed if he knew what he was predicting the future. He said he would have either been killed or he would have had his land taken away and put in prison. So it was a dangerous time to live. So he had students coming to his house, and they were pretending to be studying medicine with him, because Nostradamus was a very famous physician. He would have been remembered as a doctor if even people had forgot all about the prophecies. But he said he was teaching them medicine. Actually, he was teaching them metaphysics and teaching them to see the future the same way that he did. So that was what they were teaching. So this young man, the woman who was the student in the past life, was one that was studying with him. So as we were talking about him, that's when everything got very strange. Because all of a sudden, as she's talking to him, she said, "He wants to speak to you." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" "He wants to speak to you." And apparently he knew what his student was doing. And so, I didn't know what was going to happen. What she did, she put her hand up to keep me quiet, and she would listen to what he was saying. Then she would repeat to me what he was saying, like she was in the middle. So it's not really channeling. She was back and forth answering the questions. And she would repeat it back and forth. He's saying this, and he's telling you this. And he said he's been looking for a link to the future, because he could see that his prophecies were not being correctly interpreted, and the time is coming when they're going to come true. And he was very worried that we were not going to get the information in time. So he said, "I have an assignment for you." Yeah, I was in there, what? He said, I see there's a book in your time that has my prophecies in them. They've come down to your time. I want you to get that book, and I want you to read them to me one by one, and I will tell you what they mean, what the prophecy means, what time period it belongs to. And he said I was supposed to write it and get it into our language of our time so the people could be warmed in time. And I was thinking, oh, gee, thanks. Because who would have thought something like that? Anyway, when the woman woke up, because when they're in this level, they don't remember anything. The woman woke up, and I told her what had just happened and what she was supposed to do. She was so frightened, she moved to Alaska. So you can't say, I started it. You can't say she started it. She didn't want any part of it. She was from Alaska, and I think she decided it was time to go home. She wanted to put as much distance between me and her as she could. So, but anyway, we had time for one more session. She did agree to that before she was going to leave. And I think it was just more to appease me than anything else. So We had it in her house, and they had been moving the furniture. They were packing boxes all over the place, and they were going to have a going-away dinner for her. She said, I got 1 hour, and that's all I can do. It's just to make me feel better. So we had the session again, and it happened again. He came through again, and he said, you must do this work. It is very, very important to your time. I said, I can't. She's moving away. He said, that doesn't matter. Now that we have made this connection, you will never lose me. I will come through anybody you work with. That's a big statement because I worked with a lot of people. And he said, he gave me the instructions on how to locate him and tests to perform so I would know it was actually him that I was speaking to each time. And then the woman moved away. And it's like, okay, now what do I do? So it was a couple of months. And during that time, I wrote the first 4 chapters of the first volume of Conversations with Nostradamus, not knowing if it was going anywhere. I wanted to write it while it was fresh in my mind. And I thought nothing else, it just may go into a drawer somewhere. But I wrote the first 4 chapters. Then I decided I had a young college student. She was a music major in the organ, and she was an excellent subject. I've been doing a lot of experimenting with her with remote viewing and time travel. So I thought, well, that would be a good one to try this on, just to see if it could happen by following his instructions. So I never told her what I was going to do. We always did experiments. So I went to her house and I said, do you want to try an experiment? She said, yeah, it's okay. Just tell me what it's all about when it's over. So I followed his instructions, not knowing what was going to happen. There he was, the same man in the same room. Incidentally, this is done with a mirror. He has a black obsidian mirror that I found he would go into trance and stare at the mirror, and he would go out of his body and see all of these things. And he told us later, then when he come back into his body, he would find he had written the prophecies, the 4 lines by automatic writing. That was how it was done. Here he was, the same man in the same room with the mirror, and he said, oh, you're here, now we can continue, now we can get down to work. Of course, I was too dumbfounded that first time. I said, well, we did it. I think of doing the prophecies, I just began asking him a lot of questions about his life and everything. But that started out. The whole volume 1 is my work with Elena, was the one that went to Alaska, and then Brenda. And during that time, I got the book. I didn't know what I was reading. I would open the book anywhere it happened to be, and I would read the quatrain, the prophecy, and then I would check it off. And we'd go to another one, not knowing what I was doing. In the first book, we ended up doing about 300 of the prophecies in 6 weeks' time, only seeing her once a week. That's a lot, especially when you're working with something as complicated as this. There was no thinking at all. She would just automatically tell me what they meant. But there were a lot of times he would tell us that's not correct translation. Something's wrong here. It's not been done right. And first he would say, read it in French. That I don't know French. And the girl didn't know French either. I said, that don't matter. You don't speak French the way I do anyway. But he said, if you could keep the vowels and the consonants pure, maybe I would understand it without you butchering it too much. But I didn't want to do it unless I really had to. And he would say, well, read it. I don't know what it is. And but it was so funny. But there were times whenever we were doing it that way, and there were people in the room observing, and we had one man one time who understood French, and he said, he is correcting you in old French, not modern French. There was so much in this whole thing that was just beyond belief. But anyway, through her, we ended up doing 300, and he said, don't worry about the ones that happened in the past. They'll only be interesting to people who are interested in history. Concentrate on now. It was in the 80s and the next 20 years. that there's going to be more things happening in the next 20 years than have happened in the last 100 years. It's going to be a very important, powerful time you're living in. So he said, focus on that. And it was my job here. I'm reading these things. I don't have no idea what time period they belong in or anything. I have thousands and thousands of pages of transcript. You imagine, this was not just this one. It gets more complicated. But I had to transcribe all of that. I had to put it in some kind of order, some kind of chronological order. Now, he said many times, it's very difficult to put a time, a date on anything. You know, any psychic, it's very difficult for any of them to put a date on something. Because how do they know? He said the only way he could tell a date was if he could see a part of the sky and he could make out constellations. Then he might have an idea of some kind of a time frame. Otherwise, everything looked futuristic to him. He has no way of knowing it's all way ahead of his time. So there was no way to really date anything. And he said it doesn't matter because he explained there are nexus points. And a nexus point is an event or a personality that must happen. That is central. But from that nexus point, time branches out in many probabilities and possibilities. So we said the future is never set in stone. It can always be changed. It's malleable. This is why it's very hard to tell the future, especially imagine 400 years ahead of his time, because there's too many things that can happen that can change the event that he saw. But of these probabilities and possibilities, there is every possible outcome from the worst to the least of the event. And this is what he told me. He said, this time frame right now is so important. He said, if I tell you the most horrible things man can do to himself, will you do something to correct it? That's what he wanted us to know. People say he's doom and gloom. He said, I'm telling you the worst possible scenarios, the worst possible result of what I see. It doesn't mean that's the only result, but he wanted us to know that to shake us up. He said, you've got to get your attention. He said, otherwise you're not going to listen to me. So he told us the most horrible things that he saw. Well, anyway, this went on for about 6 months. I was working with Brenda. And she'd come to a point where she couldn't work with me anymore. That she was in college and she had to drop out. She had money problems. And so she goes to work in the local chicken plant. And those of you who live in Arkansas, you know what the chicken plants are around here. It's not a good place to work. And here she's a musician and her hands was really hurting her to work in that ice cold water with the chickens and everything. So it was miserable. So I would go to her house, and she had just got off of work late at night, and she said, I can't work. She said, all I want to do is just go to bed. I don't even want to eat anything. She said, I'm just so miserable. So I was thinking, well, this looks like this is the end of our work. Now, when we were working with Brenda, he kept telling me, Nostradamus kept saying, you're going to need a drawer of horoscopes, an astrologer, a drawer of horoscopes, because we're going to get into astrological dating. That was the only way he could date something. And I didn't know astrology. Brenda didn't know astrology. So he said he tried to do some of this, and she couldn't figure it out because she didn't have the background in her mind. He said, you're going to need a drawer of horoscopes. But he said, you will find who you need. Within a week, I was at a metaphysical meeting. This young man, John, walks in, and he said, I don't have any idea why I'm here, but I had to be here for some reason. So when he found out what I was working on with the Nostradamus material, he told me he was an astrologer and had always been fascinated by Nostradamus. Now, where could you find somebody like that in Arkansas, anyway? So he thought it was fascinating. He wanted to sit in on some of the sessions. So he'd sit there with his ephemeris, looking up the dates and things and trying to communicate with him about the dates. Well, anyway, when Brenda said she couldn't work anymore, I go to John and I tell him, this looks like to me this is the end of our story. We can't go any further. She can't work. And I said, I'm not going to force anybody to work. I don't work that way. But I said, looks like it's the end of it. And he said, why don't you put me under and see if I can contact him and I can communicate as one astrologer to another. And I said, oh yeah, I've done the impossible 3 times. You want me to do it again? And he said, yeah, why not? And I said, can't you just hear the skeptics? He said, I don't care what they say. He said, I want to finish this because we have been getting into the information on the Antichrist. We were getting dates on the shift of the world. We were getting into some very important things. He said, I must finish this. I didn't know at that time he was getting ready to move to Florida. People were always moving in and out of this whole project. So when I said, well, I can try it, but I don't know what's going to happen. So I put him under. He goes and finds Nostradamus, the same room. With him, he went through the mirror. And it was in the room with Nostradamus, walking around with him as a spirit form. And Nostradamus would pull charts off of the shelves and lay them out for him to look at, and he would explain astrological dating. In return, John taught him about Neptune and planets in Uranus that he didn't have at his time. He thought it was very strange. That's when I found out a lot of the things that he did in his day. He had medical things that he did that were way ahead of his time. He got them from observing our time. Everybody said, well, he's a miracle man. How can he come up with all these cures and things? He observed our time, and that's how he found out these things. So this is why it's so fascinating to be with him and hear the 2 time cultures and everything. And he didn't like women. He was definitely a male chauvinist. But in his day, women weren't educated. They weren't worth anything. He said the only thing they're worth for is fetch this, fetch that, and have children. Because they weren't educated. He said the only woman he ever met that was worth even talking to was Catherine de Medici, the Queen of France. And he said she should have been born a man because she was intelligent. So he was a little upset by the time we got into the 2nd volume and he found out I was a woman. He said he'd always perceived me as an energy. He said, all right, I'll just think of you as a future woman. But anyway, it's turned out to be volume 2 of the Conversations with Nostradamus was John's work, and with the astrological dating and what he found. And we were able to get the maps for the shift of the world. We got a lot of information about the Antichrist. We did an extreme amount of work during that time. One thing that was fascinating is John had always had this affinity for astrology. He just did it immediately, and he could never figure out how he got into it so easily. I did a past life on him. He went back to his last life before this one. He was in Germany during the time of Nazi Germany with Hitler. And Hitler at that time, during the Second World War, was calling in psychics and astrologers to help with the Second World War. If any of you know about that or not, I found it all to be true. So one of the things he was doing, he wanted to translate the Nostradamus prophecies to reflect that Germany was winning the war. So John was an astrologer during that time. So he was recruited to work for Hitler in the translation, and he wanted them to corrupt the quatrains, corrupt the prophecies to reflect that Germany was going to win the war. And then they made these into leaflets and they dropped them all over the different countries they were conquering. I found out all of this really did happen. But he ended up dying in that war because there was, in that lifetime, being shot because he wouldn't go along with what was happening. But to me, it was like karma coming around. Because in that lifetime, he was helping the second Antichrist, Hitler. In this lifetime, he was helping to defeat the third Antichrist by making the prophecies correct before he had corrupted them. See how karma comes around. It's amazing, these little pieces that all fit together. So anyway, we worked with John about 6 weeks, and he kept saying he was going to move to Florida. And was trying to get all of the astrological stuff done that I could possibly get done before he leaves. So finally he goes. He goes to Florida, and after he was there, I wanted to make sure everything was accurate, and I kept sending him the manuscript and the parts about the astrology to make sure it was correct. And finally he told me it doesn't make any difference because he said, I'm dying. And a lot of people, since the books have come out, wanted me to put them in touch with John so he could do their charts. What happened, after he was only there about a year, and he died of AIDS, and he was only 36 years old. And he was in the nursing home when he died. And so I dedicated the second book to John. And I sent him that, and they told me, on the wall by his bed, he had the dedication taped to the bed, to the wall. To him, it was one of the most satisfying things he had done in his life to be associated with this project. Maybe that was all he was supposed to do. Maybe that was why he had to leave so young. Who's to say? There's so much weird things that happened with this whole thing. But he did die at 36 of AIDS. So that was the second volume, dealt with the dating and the prophecies. Well, after that, I thought, well, surely I'm done. Those were the first 2 books that were published. But I had about 400 other prophecies that had never been translated. I want to finish what I start. So I thought, well, let's see what we can find. So I said, let me try this on all of my subjects that I knew could go into deep trance. So I began going to their houses, and I never told any of them what I was working on. I just said, we're just going to try an experiment. It ended up, before we were done with all of this from beginning to end, was 12 different people. So if you had just one, there's always a chance of hoax. There's always a chance of something not being right. But when you got 12 people involved, they are all saying the same thing. They're all seeing the same man in the same room, working with the same mirror. They are all repeating the same scenario of what's going to happen to the earth. There's got to be some truth in it, because none of them knew what I'd found. They didn't know what I was working on. So I ended up writing volume 3. And volume 3 was finishing up all of it with all the other people that I could find. So it's quite a fascinating story, but here we have 1,000 prophecies. There's no way you could put them all into one book. It's impossible. But he told me, focus on the time now, not the past. I put some of them in the books about the past because I wanted to show his remarkable use of symbolism and how you could figure out what he meant. Down through the ages, people can only figure that out after it happens, not before. But here we were getting it all, and it's wonderful the way his mind works. He uses a lot of Greek mythology and Greek history. To him, he said, I'm appalled at your lack of education. He said in his day, to know Greek history and Greek mythology was a sign of a well-educated man. And he said, you don't even teach it anymore. He said, in the generation before you, it was required teaching. Now, I had some in school. You know, we had the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that's about it. I don't know if they even teach that nowadays in high school now, if they still teach even that much.